Okay, so next up is stage 2, which is the attack phase or the attack stage. Again, all the information that we gathered during the pre-attack stage helps us to come up with a really thorough attack strategy. Now, typically the attack stage involves compromising the target, so we're going pretty active here. We might actually go after an exploit of a vulnerability that we discovered during the pre-attack stage, or even use some loopholes like weak security policies or password policies to try to gain access to the system. So one of the things that's important to note here is that the attacker only needs to worry about one port of entry or one mechanism to get in, where the customer or the organization or company has to worry about covering all their bases. So instead of being passive, we end up becoming, again, like I said, very active. So this time, the communication goes like this.
Alpha, this is Foxtrot. We've acquired the target, permission to engage. Foxtrot, this is Alpha, permission granted.
So we'll do that through first trying to penetrate the parameter, looking at devices that are exposed externally and how they react. We'll then go through and look at how we enumerate targets once we've made our way in. If we know what the target is, it makes it easier for us to then try to acquire the target. After we acquire the target, the next thing we want to do is be able to escalate our privileges so we can do more with that system. And then finally, we'll make sure that we can get back into the system by executing, implanting, and retracting using things like rootkits. But let's get into details on how we would actually do each one of these items. So one of the primary ways of testing the parameter is by obviously going after the firewall itself. And we're going to do this by sending and crafting some packets to check how the firewall reacts. Now this can be done by looking at how the firewall handles fragmentation, overlapping fragments, floods of packets. We can also do this by crafting some packets so we can check the ACLs of the firewall, what's allowed through and what's not. We might also take a look at how the protocols are filtered by trying to connect to various protocols such as SSH, FTP, or even Telnet. We also want to try to somehow measure the thresholds for different denial of service attacks by trying to send persistent TCP connections and seeing how the firewall handles that, as well as maybe even attempting to stream UDP connections as well. Doing this is going to tell us what the thresholds are set for at the firewall. If you want, you can also try to send some malformed URLs to see how the IDS responds. And we might even try to see how the web services actually respond to some requests like post requests, delete requests, or copy requests. Now, next we're going to then go after, again, enumerating devices. The goal of enumerating devices is trying to find out as much information about the hosts themselves. Now, some of this we may have discovered during the pre-test environment, but again, the attack phase gets us really, really active. So some of those parameters that we're going to want to try to discover would be things like, what's the device ID? Does it have a description associated to it, which helps us to identify it? What's its host name, especially if we can utilize DNS to fill that in for us? Where are the devices physically located, as well as the MAC and IP address? We'll also want to inventory the network accessibility of these devices. Now, after we've enumerated the devices, our next step would be then going through and actually acquiring the target, because now we know of everything on the network, or a good chunk of it. Based off what we've discovered, we can then go after based off vulnerabilities. Now, some of the ways that we can use to gain more information about the target would be doing things like probing assaults, meaning hit the target with different types of assaults to see which ones it's vulnerable to. Obviously, running vulnerability scans. We also might try to acquire the target by doing something really basic, like using what they refer to as trusted systems. This typically involves attempting to access the machine's resources through information we've obtained legitimately through things like social engineering attacks. Once we've acquired the target, again, our next step is to then go through and escalate the privileges. Sometimes this escalation is performed by the attacker, so to accomplish this, the pen tester will try to take advantages of bugs, flaws in the design of the OS or applications, possibly even misconfigurations on an operating system, or for that matter, an application, to try to elevate the access of a normal user to someone with higher permissions. Now, privilege escalation is normally performed by attackers to carry out different types of activities, such as deleting files, looking at sensitive information, or again, installing programs that can help them get back in later, such as a Trojan or a virus. So some of the ways that we can escalate our privileges would include things like poor security policies or taking advantage of emails or web code that's been untested to see if we can gather information that could actually lead to an escalation of privileges. We could also do it through brute force.
Deal smash!
Yeah, that was my bad green joke there. Almost kind of sounded like a beefed up Yoda, huh? Obviously, brute force is a little bit more time consuming, and we've got several tools out there that we've talked about in other courses as well. Password crackers, the Get Admin tool, Trojans, as well as obviously social engineering. Again, social engineering is one of the easiest and most preferred way for attackers to get in because it's hard to track. So after we've escalated the privileges of an account, the next thing we want to do is go through and try to execute, implement, and retract. Now, by this point, the tester has effectively compromised the acquired system by executing certain types of code. Some of those would be obviously exploits. Some systems are vulnerable to denial of service attacks, as well as buffer overflows. And of course, the good old viruses, rootkits, Trojans, and malware. So if I'm able to establish a rootkit or Trojan, that can actually lead to access to more information or more system resources. I then want to go through and see if I can cover my tracks by erasing log files or hiding modifications that I've made. Now, the tester is also going to want to make sure that he can change system settings and remain hidden. So he wants to see if he's able to be detected. And then, of course, after I've done all that, I want to make sure that I can get back in via my backdoor and see if any red flags have been thrown. Now, again, if you're not familiar with some of these concepts, I've got to recommend that you go back and watch some of our courses that cover each one of these domains.